Today is March 19th, 2025, and my guest is author and journalist Ross Douthat. He is an opinion columnist for the New York Times, and our topic for today is his latest book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Ross, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Before we begin, I want to mention this conversation may cover some themes inappropriate for young children. Feel free to screen this if you are a parent. As most EconTalk listeners know, I'm a religious Jew. Some listeners, when discovering that, write me and say they're surprised because they've always thought I was intelligent. I sometimes respond by saying, well, you know, a lot of intelligent people in history have been believers. Isaac Newton, C.S. Lewis, Maimonides. And a typical response I get then is, well, sure, then a smart person could be a believer, but now, I mean, those people wouldn't be religious now. Your book is an attempt to justify belief or the exploration of belief from an intelligent perspective. Give us the thumbnail for the skeptics out there. How could a thoughtful, intelligent, rational, educated, enlightened person in 2025 actually believe in an invisible being that you and I would call God?
So the conceit of the book is that most of the reasons that made it seem reasonable to be religious back then, as your correspondents would put it, still obtain today. And that there is a sort of master narrative of modern secularism or modern atheism that says, look, you know, there were good reasons to believe before Copernicus and Galileo, or there were good reasons to believe before Charles Darwin, or maybe some people would say there were good reasons to believe before neuroscience, or, you know, the different sort of scientific revolutions are picked out and identified. And I think that those revolutions did, in fact, call into question certain specific tenets of specific religions. And, you know, we operate in the West inside a monotheistic Abrahamic heritage. You know, we've had a sort of heavily Christian-dominated culture. And there's no question that, you know, the early scientific revolutions and revelations about, you know, the shape of the cosmos and the solar system and everything else challenged medieval Catholicism's conception of, you know, the order of the planets and the sun and the stars, which was, I think, not really strictly speaking, a point of Catholic doctrine. It was more an inheritance from Ptolemy, but you know, it was something the church was committed to, and that very famously created a particular crisis. Darwinism goes a little further and calls into question a lot of readings, Jewish and Christian, I would say, but especially Christian because of Christian ideas about original sin of the book of Genesis and the origins of human life, right? So it's absolutely the case that science can and has challenged particular doctrines and particular beliefs. But the general religious picture, and this is a book that, you know, I think for various reasons tries to start by laying out a very general case for why someone would be religious before you get to whether you should be Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Buddhist or whatever else. The general religious argument that we find ourselves in a universe that appears to be structured and designed in ways conducive to the emergence, not just of order and sort of regularity and mathematical patterns, but planets, stars, and conscious life. That's a striking thing. There are lots of other possible universes that, you know, that would not contain anything quite like the world in which we find ourselves. The fact that there's a correspondence between that overarching structure and the mystery of our own consciousness, our own mind, and its ability to penetrate into the deep mysteries of the cosmos and to understand them. And then the fact that a persistent feature of human culture from ancient times, from back then, as your correspondents would say, to the present, is religious and spiritual experience, intimations, experiences, some of them more commonplace, some of them more outre, some of them alarming, but experiences that persist under secular conditions, experiences that happen to people who don't believe in God as well as people who believe in God, experiences that seem to give strong indicators that there are invisible forces in the world, higher powers, if you will, that are interested in communicating with and being in some kind of relationship with us. I think that combination, general order yielding human life, a correspondence between our consciousness and the general order, and constant, persistent, enduring intimations of transcendence is enough to make it very, very rational to be a religious believer of some kind.
And you couch it in the right way, I think, the probabilistic way, that we're not talking about absolute certainty. That's one of the other gifts of science and the modern perspective. We're not talking about 100% chance. The question is there evidence that might comfort a would-be believer that is rational? I just want to add, by the way, that in your brief thumbnail, which is lovely, of how science challenged faith, the other, I think, narrative about the past, which I find amusing, is that everyone believed in God and was 100% religious until Darwin. And then nobody believed in God anymore except a few crazy people. I'm pretty confident there's been non-believers throughout much of the ancient past, and that science did have an effect on where the balance of the evidence lay for some people. But this idea that people were robotic people who were comforted constantly by, say, the existence of an afterlife is, I think, kind of a foolish way to look at human history.
I agree. And I think you, at the very least, you would say you have only to look at human behavior in the past to get a strong indication that whatever people formally believed, they were not living their life in some way where it was, they were not manifesting the kind of certainty in belief that you associate with, saints, great philosophers of religion, pious peasant women, whoever else, right? One thing in Christianity, we have a lot of debates about the doctrine of hell. That is a big point of debate and discussion always, but especially nowadays. And one thing you'll often hear is a complaint from critics of the doctrine who say that, the fear of hell was this sort of horrible punishing thing that hung over every Christian believer for the last 2,000 years and made their life a misery. And obviously there are cases where that is true. There are people whose psychology has been warped by an overemphasis on eternal damnation. But if you go back and look at the history of the Middle Ages and how Christians were actually behaving at what was, I think it's fair to say, a peak of formal belief in the doctrine of hell, I don't get the strong sense that, the average knight and chevalier in 13th century France was waking up every day thinking, hell, it's this thing that I have to think about all the time that's that's preventing me from having a good time and, smiting my enemies and bedding my mistress and anything like that. People have always been people. And have always tended to prioritize the immediate and the material, even under cultural conditions, obviously, that make religious belief seem more compelling and more commonplace.
Now, I want to start with the topic as we get into the details of the book. I want to alert listeners who are not interested in this topic that I won't let it go on for more than 5 or 10 minutes. I'm sure many of you out there are tired of this topic. I am ceaselessly intrigued by it, so I don't know how painful it is for you out there. But we're going to talk about consciousness, and in particular, what the book, and you write about this quite poetically and quite beautifully, there is a belief, very common belief among highly educated people, that there is nothing beyond the material. That the brain is a set of electrical signals. There's no such thing as the soul. That's a childish idea that we have no material evidence for. And so as a result, a lot of the things that people say about the human experience, those are just the freakish electrical signals that the brain produces. And that's just the reality we have to face. You alluded to the advances in neuroscience. We've looked into the brain. There's no soul there. There's no little creature, the real us. So what does consciousness and the brain have to do with your view of belief?
I sort of think that a primary question that drives the divide between the religious person and the non-religious person is what do we think is the primary thing in the cosmos? We have access as people experiencing life to two broad categories of things. One is mind. It's the direct experience of being a conscious being, whatever that may mean, right? It's an experience you're having right now, having this conversation. And the second experience is the experience of matter and the material world, which is filtered through our conscious experience, right? If I touch the table here or, rub my laptop screen or something, I'm having an encounter with the material, but that is then being translated in some way into my conscious experience, the experience of being a self in the world. And I think the religious argument is basically just that we have a variety of good reasons to think that mind is probably primary and matter, while real. The question of what matter actually is itself a slightly harder question to answer than some materialists tend to think. But you said only 5 or 10 minutes, so we'll set that one aside and just say there are good reasons to think that mind is something primary. And those reasons start with the fact that it is very, very hard to give a clear account of how the experience of mind arises in any kind of direct, scientifically testable way from the electrical impulses and everything else and chemical reactions in the brain. Clearly, the two are intertwined in some way. And, obviously, neuroscience has demonstrated convincingly that certain parts of the brain have certain effects on your consciousness. But we sort of knew that already because we knew that drinking strong spirits had a strong effect on your consciousness. But we know a lot more about that now. So there's I think, a sort of hard Cartesianism where, mind and body are completely separate in some way, and they only attach at one particular point. That seems wrong. Consciousness somehow interpenetrates the material. But yeah, there's no good account on offer from any materialist or reductionist. And I've read most of those accounts that it actually explains what consciousness is and how it works. And the best you can get to is a kind of illusionist case, in a sense, which says that, consciousness is sort of, it's an illusion of control, right? We have the illusion of selfhood and the illusion of control, and this is advantageous in some way that is then hard to explain because presumably if it's an illusion of control, all the processes would run the same way without this sense of being a spectator and a passenger and an actor, right? So it's sort of like, you think that you're making choices and making decisions, but really you're just sort of watching a movie and thinking you're participating in it. But wouldn't it be simpler to have a universe where there wasn't, where the systems just ran on their own if the conscious observer isn't actually doing anything? So I think materialism struggles to explain consciousness, but then we also just have a number of sort of more specific reasons recently, including the ones I alluded to before, but adding in some of the spooky stuff that goes on with quantum physics and the way that measurement and mind seems to interact and sort of collapse possibility into reality. There's a number of ways, I think, in which the case for mind as a primary thing has actually gotten stronger in the last 100 years, notwithstanding all the advances in neuroscience and everything else.
The way I think about it is our command of the material world as human beings has expanded unimaginably over the last century. It's part of a much longer process, obviously. But we understand extraordinary things about the universe, about the cosmos, about the microcosmos. It's a weird thing that one of the few mysteries the brain has failed to fathom is the brain. It's kind of, it's like, well, it's only one way to look at it is it's only one thing. It's, we've done an extraordinary job everywhere else. So this is just one little corner we're struggling with. It's kind of an important corner. It's the corner with which we access the universe, and our experience could just be, it's a matter of time. Some people believe that. Some people believe it will always be veiled from us. Using a brain to understand the brain may be beyond our capabilities. Alan Lightman on this program, we'll link to that episode, interviewed him a few times, but on one of our conversations, his view is that, and I think this is a common view among scientists, is that the brain's capability is just a bonus. Some of the more aspects of the brain, like which we might talk about, yearning, I would talk about a sense of justice, regret, embarrassment, many of the human emotions that we experience intensely inside this little thing that we carry around with us called our head. Those are just things that they're just sometimes negative bonuses, sometimes positive bonuses. They're just things that came along for the ride. And you're arguing essentially that that's not a very appealing argument. It's not an appealing argument for sure. It could be true, but it's not appealing.
Well, I think that the weakness, and I've read a bunch of Lightman actually, and the problem is still the explanation of whether they're a bonus or not, right? Whether are they essential to the functioning of the brain or not, right? Could you have human beings without consciousness? Could you have zombies, right? As the idea, zombies, basically human beings who do everything that conscious beings do, but are in fact not conscious, right? Could that exist? And those are really interesting questions, but there is still also just the primary question of how do you get consciousness? Like how do you get it? How do you actually generate this kind of particular experience, which has different layers, right? Like there's sort of a primary experience just of the mystery of like yourself in the world. You're having the experience of this conversation. Like, how do you experience the redness of a rose, right? The qualia, to use the lingo of neuroscientists, the qualities of existence that are not explained just by deconstructing the chemical composition of the rose. Then you have above that like reason and judgment, right? Like what is it to reason? Human beings reason abstractly. What does that mean in the context of a material cosmos? How does a strictly material cosmos generate abstract reasoning that works? That's sort of the further question, right? You mentioned we've unraveled all these mysteries, figured out all these things, developed an abstract language of mathematics that just happens to correlate really well with how objects work in the real world. How does any of that work? And Lightman, as I recall, spends a certain amount of time talking about emergence, right, which is the sort of catch-all term that would be, well, they wouldn't say they're reductionists. The people, they would say, we're not reductionists because we think consciousness is real. We just think it's emergent. It's an emergent property. And I'm not sure if I'm getting the Lightman one right, but I think he talks about like the motion of a car, right? Like it emerges from the wheel and the axle and everything else, right? So it's not, you can't define it to one material thing, but you know it when you see it. But consciousness is just not like the motion of a car. You can observe the motion of a car and draw a strict material correlation between the movement of all the parts and the larger motion. There's no such connection with consciousness. When people talk about emergence, to me, they're still talking about magic.
And of course, and we're now about to move on to a new topic, but we're going to stop at one that I think I'm also more interested than my average listener, which is AI and whether it will become conscious. What many AI researchers believe is that just as the brain, the electrical signals of the chemicals and the flesh, the physical entity of the brain yields consciousness in a way that we don't fully understand, that any one piece is not decisive, but all of them together allows consciousness to emerge. They believe that AI will have the same experience, that although we don't understand exactly how artificial intelligence currently works in responding to our queries on chatbots using LLMs, it's a matter of time. It'll just coalesce and emerge the way consciousness emerged out of the human physical things, and then the AIs will be conscious and will have many of the experiences that humans have, of agency, of longing, of regret. My example, listeners are probably tired of, but that a Roomba, that a vacuum cleaner might wish it had become a driverless car and yearn for that could someday happen.
Right.
I'm a skeptic, but the truth is I have trouble explaining my skepticism because I don't understand how humans have yearnings to be other things and to regret what they've chosen and the paths they've staked out. So since I don't understand that, I can't really rule out a machine being able to reach that place, but I'm skeptical. So
I think that's the right posture for the person like you and I who thinks that this is a seeming hard limit on materialism. You should be skeptical that just by sort of building a machine without having any conception of how to make it conscious, but just building something that seems to produce outputs that are like the human mind, you'll get the inner experience. But you shouldn't rule it out precisely because we don't have a materialist account of how consciousness emerges, right? So it is, it would, if it turned out that at some level of complexity, AI suddenly manifests consciousness and again, it'd be hard to prove exactly. The proof question would be a tricky one. I certainly think people will think AIs are conscious before they are.
Yeah.
I think that is almost certain. But if it did emerge, that would not actually prove anything about materialism, because materialism still wouldn't have an account of how it had actually happened, right? And I mean, to put on my like spooky, weird religious stuff hat for a minute too, there is an element in the AI project of a kind of, in Jewish terms, it's the golem legend, right?
Yeah.
But it's a summoning, right? There is in some way an actual sense in which the AI project is saying, we are building agents that can do human things. And at some level, we sort of expect to call up out of the vasty deep a spirit that will inhabit them, which is part of the strangeness of our own time. I think there's sort of a general strangeness that is one reason I wrote this book now, is that I think we're in a stranger moment than we were 10 or 15 years ago in terms of sort of the spiritual and the material.
And I think that's right. Let's turn to it, as I promised, a different topic. And, as a believer, there are certain arguments people make for faith that give me the willies. I'm sure you find that as well. One of those is relying on coincidences to prove the hand of God. Usually for me, that just shows a lack of understanding of probability, or I'll just say it that way. Another area that I'm troubled by, but you are not, is near what we would call near-death experiences. You write about that. You write about mystical experiences, so-called spiritual experiences. I think many people have, and Alan Lightman writes about it in quite eloquent terms, an experience of transcendence or awe. Hard to understand where that would come from in a material world, but we have it. But near death is, and what people experience in near death experiences is, it's never spoken to me, but I want you to make the case, and you've studied it much more than I have. So take a shot.
Sure. Well, so first, I agree with you that there are certain forms of religious experience that you would expect to happen, or expect some version of them to show up, even were religion not true, God didn't exist, and so on, right? And coincidence, the person who has a dream that turns out to come true, right? Like, people have a lot of dreams. You live a long time. Eventually, one of them is going to stand out and look prophetic just through the law of large numbers, right? So I think there are ways, and now that doesn't mean I'm ruling out that you could actually have a prophetic dream. I'm just saying, like, certain things that people experience are expected to some degree within a cosmos that is not created by God.
Before you go on and get to near death, you should make a reference, because it is kind of extraordinary as a case of this kind, the Michael Shermer experience. It's a little bit off the charts. It did kind of. It was interesting.
Yeah, so that's more. I think the supernatural or mystical experiences that are more persuasive are the ones that don't seem like just law of large numbers things, that have some sort of concrete reality in terms of either the intensity of the personal experience, the correlates like physical healing, near-death experiences, which I'll get to in a minute, or the example that I used, which is from the professional skeptic, Michael Shermer, a really smart guy who spent most of his career debunking bad paranormal and supernatural claims. And at one point in his life, he was getting married, and his wife had a radio that had been given to her, I think by her great uncle, but someone who had passed away who meant a lot to her, who she wished could be at the wedding. And the radio had never worked. It was an old radio. It was broken. Shermer himself had tried to fix it repeatedly, could never get it to work. And on their wedding day, they, went back into their house after the ceremony. They were, and they heard music coming from the back of the house. And they went in. I'm not sure if they found it in the drawer. I can't remember the details, but it was the radio, and it was playing a love song, kind you would dance to at a wedding. And it did this during the wedding, and then it shifted over to some kind of like appropriate like classical music or something in the evening, and then it stopped and it never worked again. And Shermer was clearly really struck by this, and to his credit, he has written about it several times and tried to come up with different theories. Maybe there's a multiverse and her great uncle is still alive in another branch of the multiverse, and they have a way of communicating across the multiverse, right? I mean, you can come up with theories, but it clearly, it's a good case study of the kind of thing, and I've known many people who have had things like this happen to them, the kind of thing that happens in the world that you need some explanation besides just coincidence and the law of large numbers to explain. And I do feel like people underestimate, because we live in a regime of official secularism. Plenty of people are religious, but if you go over to Yale Law School or write a Wikipedia entry or something, you're expected to sort of rule out supernatural ideas. People underestimate just how commonplace these kind of like weird experiences are. Not in the sense that most people are having them all the time, but lots and lots of people have a couple things that happened in their life that seem like, sort of like a finger pushing in a little bit. Near-death experiences then, sorry, did you want to?
No, I was just going to say there's a natural, I think there's those who are listening and haven't heard that story, and I had not heard it before I read it in your book, the radio story. I think the world's divided into two groups of people. The people who love the idea that could be true, and not just that it happened or that Michael Shermer tells the story, but rather that the world could work that in that mysterious, mystical, and beautiful way. A lot of movies exploit that human longing. And then there's the other group of people, or people who just assume Michael Shermer was on drugs that night, or he did something. Somebody tampered with his manuscript when he was setting it up for publication. They can't bear the idea that such a thing could be true, rather than the other group that longs for it. So I just wanted to mention, I think that's just an interesting part of the human experience. But you can react to that if you want, and then you can talk about near death.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are certainly people for whom the default assumption, and this is sort of goes back to David Hume, right, is that if there's a miracle, by definition, it's so unlikely that you should look for any other explanation. And, even though you think Michael Shermer seems like a trustworthy guy, and he's put this story in enough books that if he had really been on drugs at the time, probably someone would have mentioned it and said, Shermer, he was pretty, he's pretty out there at that wedding. Nonetheless, the default should be that he and his spouse were deceived in some way where, had someone else been there, they would not have seen the same thing or had the same experience, right? Near-death experiences, I don't want to sort of push this too hard. I have a strong interest in these stories. I don't think you can say things that are completely definitive about them, but basically some meaningful percentage of people who experience something close to death. I'm not going to say it's death because there's endless debates about when brain activity ceases and when you're really dead. But people who come to the threshold of death and then come back have a strikingly consistent kind of experience of, that involves the cliches that, you hear about in pop culture, that, you encounter dead relatives and ancestors. Sometimes you have a feeling of a kind of life review under moral judgment, right? There's some, it's not always under strong moral judgment. Sometimes it's just a review of your life. There's the tunnel, there's the white light, there's feelings of love and peace and so on. And then, and this exists across cultures. It takes different forms. There are sort of, you'll get some Buddhist features in near-death experiences in China and some Hindu features. And, there's clearly some sort of impact of cultural expectations or religious expectations on what you see, which is itself an interesting point. But these experiences they're quite different as far as I can tell from reading the literature and from talking to some people who've had them, from hallucinatory experiences or dreams, which are the two things they're most often analogized to. They have a intensity and clarity of experience. They're perceived as more real than real. They are life-changing. People who come back from them change their metaphysical perspectives, change their moral perspectives, sometimes in ways that don't go well. Like you'll have people who are like, I'm committed to a higher power and I'm leaving my family or something. Like it's not like a simple, everyone just becomes good because of this, but it's life-changing, right? And did you want to jump in? Sorry. And I think what you can say about them, at the very least, this is sort of my minimalist case for taking them seriously, is that it's really easy. Like there have been plenty of near-death experiences in the human past, but we really just have not brought nearly as many people back from the brink of death in most of human history as we've done in the last 50 or 100 years, right? And it's just really easy to imagine a timeline where we start resuscitating lots more people under modern medicine, and we get a consistent pattern of near-death experiences where they're always just a complete chaotic jumble, what you'd expect from, a brain misfiring, going terminal, or they're dreamlike, and it's like, they partake of the subconscious in some way, but it's dream logic. Things don't make sense. You can't remember them after they're over. That is what I think the materialist or the anti-supernaturalist who thinks there's absolutely no life after death would predict that you would get from bringing lots more people back, as we've done. And that's not what we've gotten. We've gotten these, again, sort of persistent cross-cultural patterns of experiences that have certain things in common that seem kind of religious, kind of like God's out there. There are hellish ones and purgatorial ones too, right? It's not the case that everyone who has a near death, like people have ones where the judgment, sense of isolation, like there's darker things. So it's also not just as simple as near death experiences prove that everyone goes to heaven or anything like that. But yeah, I think that the fact that this is, that you get something like this persistently in a situation where you're bringing lots of people back from the dead, you have to counted as a point in religion's favor. Don't have to believe it all, but you have to say, if we didn't have them, anti-supernaturalists would be saying reasonably, like, look, you say there's life after death. Why doesn't anyone who ever comes back from the brink of death say anything about this? But in this world, it's an interesting indicator.
Yeah, my skepticism on that. I mean, I'm agnostic about it. It doesn't move me either way particularly, but there could be lots of people who have jumbly, awful experiences. They just don't get talked about as much. I would worry about that selection bias. And of course, the other worry now is that you're supposed to see a light at the end of a tunnel, and I think that's seeded, and you're supposed to review your life, and there's supposed to be dead people welcoming you as into the next world. And I just wonder how much of that's just an hallucination from having heard about it in the past. The problem with
but I mean, there you. So one thing that's interesting is that the people who start studying this in the 1960s find that Raymond Moody is the first person to really write about this. People are embarrassed. Like, people don't want to tell the stories in many cases. They're sort of embarrassed to tell them. Like, they feel like, this is this sort of profound thing that happened to me, but I can't really explain it. And I know that my doctors won't believe it, so I don't talk about. Like, there was sort of a taboo around it for a while. Also, there isn't any kind of clear correlation where religious believers have these experiences and atheists and skeptics do not. You get, to the extent that people have tried to do statistical analysis, it seems like you're perfectly likely to have a near-death experience without being a practicing member of a faith who has sort of a set of expectations. And then finally, I mean, I think the sort of wish fulfillment thing, like, so there's what you might call near death experiences that people have. So when there's a lot of literature on this from sort of hospices and places where people are sort of steered in toward death in their final days. There's a lot of literature on people when they get, within a few days often of dying, and hospice workers, can tell, like, okay, this person's a few days off from dying. They start to see people, like dead people. This is quite commonplace, spouse, parent, sibling, etc. That, I think, the skeptic can just say, look, this is sort of the brain has evolved this capacity to hallucinate in these ways at the brink of death because it, smooths the passage and so on. It's a little harder to make that case with things that you wouldn't actually come back, like under the normal run of evolutionary experience, people were not coming back from the dead, right? You get killed by a rampaging leopard wherever, in a million BC,
saber-toothed tiger,
something, saber-toothed tiger, right? You get killed. Like, what's the evolutionary adaptation in, as you're bleeding out on the ground, seeing a white light that you're never going to tell Grok, your fellow tribesman, about? Right. Again, can you come up with some evolutionary gesto story for why it would be beneficial? Maybe, but I think it's more of a leap and less of what you would expect. I think the skeptic is on firmer ground, saying this is what I'd expect with things that happen to people while they're still alive and fully conscious, than things that we've only found out about by virtue of resuscitating lots of people who in a prior dispensation would have just died.
This program is called EconTalk. People get mad when I consider changing the name to something like our tagline, Conversations for the Curious. But there is an EconTalk piece to this conversation, which I don't think has ever been raised on this program before, which is you're making the case for religion. You're encouraging people to go on a journey, a quest to explore it. Should church membership be tax deductible, say, in the United States? And the question I'm asking is it a benefit to the United States that people will join communities of faith besides for themselves? As a classical liberal, when I lived in the United States, I just felt uneasy about the subsidies to religious life. I've challenged people about that. They don't have a good answer. They don't. I like to think that having people of faith who come together in religious communities is good for the body public, but you can make the opposite case easily. We'll talk maybe about that later, but what's your view on that? Do you think it's good for a country to have religious people in it?
Yes. I mean, I think...
Sorry. Just to make it sharper, should other people pay for that practice on the grounds that it's good for them, not just the practitioner? That's the better way to sharpen it.
Yeah. I mean, this is the terrain, honestly, where a lot of people are actually more comfortable, in my experience, having debates about religion. The sort of, there's a lot of people who shy away from the kind of conversation we were just having, but who are more comfortable once you get into a zone of whether or not religion's true. Is it good for society in ways that then would have policy implications? I think the answer broadly is that it is. This is sort of I think in ways that extend, though, beyond religious communities alone. I think religion generally, not in every case. You can have toxic forms of religion that don't do this, but religion in the Western world, in the US, historically, has been a powerful source of sort of non-governmental social capital, sort of civic engagement, in ways that doesn't sort of fully substitute for, but does substitute for some of the operations of the state, especially in a society that has a welfare state, right? So, if you're the strictest libertarian and you want to abolish the welfare state, maybe this argument doesn't have as much purchase, or maybe it has more purchase, right? Maybe there's more case for making. But I think in general, sort of tax favoritism towards sort of Tocquevillian enterprises is a good thing, and religion falls under that category in the same way that, the tax deduction for charitable giving, which applies not only to the religious but to the non-religious, right? Like I think it's good to have some kind of tax favoritism for sort of social engagement with positive externalities. Might be the economisty way of putting it. And in the US, religion historically has really clearly fallen into that category. Now, is there any limit on that? Like, for instance, I am currently, totally open to the idea of taxing university endowments at a certain level, right? I think tax exemptions for educational enterprises are good, but when you have an enterprise that's essentially running a giant hedge fund and is having, in my view, a terrible effect on American life, like having some taxation is okay. And then I've made that argument. I've had people associated with universities come back to me and say, well, what about, the Catholic Church owning all this property in Manhattan that's worth millions and millions of dollars? And in principle, I wouldn't have I wouldn't have a problem saying there's some level of accumulated wealth at which maybe a tax could kick in, right? Like if it turns out that, the Mormon Church has $300 trillion because they've been so good at preparing for the apocalypse or something, and somebody said, look, the US has a huge budget deficit, we need to have a tax on religious endowments that kicks in at at some high level. I don't have like a hard principled objection where you can never tax a religious enterprise. But I think certainly under current American cultural conditions, where most religious institutions are not rich, they're poor, they're hand to mouth. Most Catholic parishes are not rolling in USAID money, no matter what the Trump administration might sometimes suggest. I think tax exempt status is generally a good thing.
Yeah, actually, similar issues arise here in Israel with the subsidies to the so-called ultra-Orthodox. I would actually take a different view, at least as a first take. My first take would be that forcing irreligious or explicitly atheist citizens to finance what they see as an illusion on the part of their fellow citizens is not good for religious practice. I think it discourages people from joining the religious fray. It embitters them, and correctly, in my view. So my preference, whether there's a case or not, I would prefer that the government not subsidize religion, understanding religious organizations, understanding that will probably mean there are fewer and there will be smaller, but at the same time, it will not have a backlash on the part of people having to pay for something they literally do not believe in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the American situation is a little distinctive in this way, where we have never had an established church, right? So we've always sort of had, not always, like there's been variations, but sort of treating religion as a sort of general good that's part of sort of the goods of civil society, I think has historically felt different to people than like the particular subsidy that you get for an established church even now in many parts of Europe, right? So like in Germany, German Catholics pay the Kirche tax or whatever, right, that funds German Catholicism. German Catholicism is therefore extremely wealthy, even though very few German Catholics go to church. And you have to like literally, renounce Catholicism in order to stop paying that tax. I think that's obviously a bad system. And Israel seems to me to be kind of in this middle zone between the American model and sort of, formal old school European establishment, where it has a kind of soft establishment of religion that's related to its sort of, its existence and identity as a Jewish state, that then takes on a sort of sharper edge in the subsidies you're describing. I think the resentment of that is entirely understandable, but is, again, somewhat different from a situation where you have 7 different Protestant churches in a town and, they all get a tax exemption, but they're all like running a soup kitchen, and, it sort of comes out a bit in the wash.
Now, the first part of the book covers what we've been talking about, which is it makes the case for there being something that's not material, something that's above and beyond our understanding. Really nicely done. And then you are faced with a more difficult challenge, which is, but I have to pick an actual religion. I can't just think, well, maybe there's more to this world than is found in my philosophy. Maybe there's something that's not material. But then you have to actually you make the case for embracing a doctrine of a particular religion. And I want to ask about that in a different way than you talk about in the book. I'm going to ask the question in a different framing. It's one thing to believe that the world may have been set in motion in some sense by something purposeful that we call God. It's another thing to think that force still is around, cares about me, and asks things of me. And to me, that's the real crux of choosing a faith, a particular faith. It's interesting intellectually to embrace the idea of the possibility that there is a force in the universe behind its existence, but to go to the next step, which is that there's one that cares about me and asks things of me, is for many people, I think, a bridge too far. What's your reaction?
Well, and this is where I think the idea of converging lines of evidence is important, right? I think someone could be persuaded by, some form of the arguments from design supplemented by the evidence for sort of fine-tuning in the physical laws of the cosmos. They could look at all of that and be talked into something like you just suggested, that something set this in motion. There's some kind of original intent, right? Some kind of deist maker. But it seems like a bit much to go from there to the author of all of this vastness actually cares about me. I think, though, once you get into the next 2 converging lines of argument that we talked about already, right? Start with the nature of consciousness. Okay, so consciousness our consciousness seems to have some connection to that larger cosmic order. It's capable of understanding it and sort of penetrating it. As far as we can tell, there aren't a lot of species in this vast universe. It gets into debates about aliens. But at the very least, we seem to be pretty distinctive in having this capacity. And then, as you mentioned, this capacity has along with it a moral sense, as a desire for justice, a interest in what is a good life, like an interest in all of these impulses that aren't just towards understanding. They are there, like understanding is part of it, but impulses towards
survival. They don't seem to be solely related to propagating the species.
Right. And there's, I didn't get into that in the book because I tried to sort of steer away from strictly Darwinian and evolutionary territory because that's so fraught and culture war-y. But yeah, I think it is at the very least strongly indicated that we have moral impulses that transcend mere survival, the mere impulse towards the survival of our genes. So you have those facets of consciousness, and then, yeah, I mean, if you find all of that persuasive, but find all evidence for religious experience or mystical experience to be just total woo-woo nonsense, then maybe you still don't quite get to the point of being convinced to join a religion. But I think if you approach the evidence for religious experience with an open mind and combine it with the fact that our consciousness has these moral impulses, this desire to figure out what the good is, that when you combine all of those things, then you do have a pretty strong case that, if there is an author of the universe, if there's a higher power, they might be interested in some kind of relationship with us. And there might be some way in which we should be trying to have a relationship and bring our lives into some kind of accordance with what they want. Especially if there's life after death, right? Not only, but especially. And I think out of that is the case for religion. The big religions present themselves as systems, technologies, if you will, for helping people figure out how should we be in relationship with whatever powers put us here, and what does it mean to be a good person in that context. And can you do that on your own? Maybe. Is it smart to do it on your own? Not, never submit or join or participate. I think it's not usually smart. And I think you can see that from just looking at other areas of human life. Can you play a sport on your own? You can, but you're never going to be that good at it. Can you do politics if you never, join any political organization? I guess you can tweet a lot, right? But joining and participating is, in most areas of human life, is how you actually get somewhere with whatever you're doing that you think is important. And I think there's no reason to think religion would be any different.
Sometimes I worry about my own religious observance and faith because I think that perhaps religion is indeed the opiate of the masses. Maybe this is just comforting to me in various ways. It's pleasant much of the time, not always, obviously, but it's often pleasant on its own terms. But then on the flip side, opium is the opiate of the masses. So, if you're religious, you have this thing that could be described as a crutch. But if you're not religious, one of the appeals of that is you don't have to have any responsibilities. And we just had Jeff Sebo on the program. It hasn't aired yet. Ross, you haven't heard it, but listeners to this podcast episode will have heard the Sebo episode if they wish. And he cares a lot about non-humans. It's a beautiful thing. He cares about dogs and octopi and ants and maybe in other things and perhaps AI. And I challenged him, and I challenged Peter Singer. Why bother? Why would you care about those things? Shouldn't you just have fun? And if you're not a belief, all I'm trying to say is religious belief comes with a benefit, and so does disbelief. And they're both for me, kind of symmetric. And I think we sometimes forget that.
Yeah, and I think the religious belief is, I don't think it's an opiate. I do think it's a crutch. And in ways that don't tell you necessarily anything about whether it's true or not, right? The last book I wrote before this one was about having chronic Lyme disease and being really sick. What that's like. And that was, one of the most, not one of, it was the most harrowing experience of my life. And I can't imagine how I would have gotten through it if I didn't believe in a God who, had allowed this to happen for what, I thought had to be some reason, and I had to just sort of deal with it and get through it. And so religion was a crutch for me, absolutely, throughout that experience. In ways that don't prove that God exists, right? It could have just been like, I needed this psychological crutch to get through the experience. But I completely agree that in other contexts, clearly the absence of belief holds deep attractions to people. Like, there's a reason people like the John Lennon song so much, the worst song in the world, right? From a religious perspective, Imagine, right? Imagine there's no heaven. Some of it is like, oh, you don't have to worry about hell anymore. But most of it is like, imagine that the stakes aren't that high. Stakes just aren't that high. It's not a big deal. You screw up, do terrible things, do mediocre things, and it's all going to be over. Everyone ends up in the same place. Relax. I think people obviously, under some circumstances, find that tremendously appealing and find religion unattractive because it seems to break that spell a little bit and say, oh, maybe it counts after all. Maybe you should wake up.
Yeah, I think sometimes about one of my favorite groups, music groups, is Great Big Sea. They have a song called Consequence Free. And the refrain is, I want to be consequence free. I want to be where nothing needs to matter. It's a human longing. It's a real thing. It's unpleasant to be told you have responsibilities. And, just as an aside, my view on the crutch is, yeah, it's a crutch. Don't you need one? Aren't we all broken? Aren't we all struggling to get by in this world? And why would you, if someone said, here, this will help you walk, this will help you on your journey, you'll be able to make your way. I take it. The next topic I want to talk about is we could spend the next, 5 or 10, 20 episodes of EconTalk on any one of them. So I'm going to ask you, Ross, if possible, to be just relatively brief. But you talk about the 3 big challenges to your claims, and I think they are you did a beautiful job in both deciding what those are, and your answers are thoughtful. One of those is one I've spent a lot of time reading and thinking about, which goes under the name of theodicy, the suffering that exists in the world. If God is good, God is just, why is there so much suffering? The second is organized religion doesn't have the best track record in human affairs. You and I might talk about our personal improvement from being a religious person. I feel that. I think it makes me a better person. But certainly you could debate whether religion writ large has been a net benefit for the world. Interesting question. And the third, which I thought was very, very thoughtful, was sex. The obsession, it seems, of religions with sexual constraints, sexual restraints, sexual restrictions, rules, interpretations. It's kind of a bummer. And it's kind of more than that. It's like, doesn't that seem a little bit unhealthy? Isn't there a better thing to focus on? So talk briefly if you can. Sorry to say briefly because these are large.
No, it's. I'll try and be very quick. Yeah. Settle all these problems in 1 minute or less. I think the last one is, on the one hand, a very culturally powerful idea right now that, religious strictures on sex are just misogynist or cruel or unnecessary or puritanical. But also, it's the one that I think is actually the weakest argument. Not in every particular case. Not in the sense of obviously traditional religions are right about, condemning divorce or something like that. Like you can argue the specifics of any particular sexual point, but in general, sex is really important. Religions care about sex so much because sex is bound up in, it's the taproot of all human relations and community and family, all human social organization, all sort of psychological formation is connected to love, right? To romance, to relationships, but to sex. And and I think you can see in the world that we have made with less religion over the last 50 or 60 years, ways in which sex without strictures can, on the one hand, become extremely destructive. I think we've gone through phases since the sexual revolution where there have been deep and bitter social consequences for sort of making sex too casual, making promiscuity, making divorce sort of casual things. I think the history of America in the 1970s is sort of a long testament to the problems with that approach. But then also what you see now, I think, in the world is something different, that like sort of sex also kind of needs encouragement, right? One thing religions do, they put strictures on sex, but they also encourage you to have it. Not if you're a Catholic priest, right? Not in every case. But the Bible starts with be fruitful and multiply. There's wedding imagery throughout both the Old and New Testaments. This is a, even in, the Christian emphasis on celibacy, there's a lot of wedding stuff going on. And the interesting thing about the world today is that people aren't getting married. They aren't having kids. They aren't having sex at all. They're substituting sort of virtual forms of sex. And I just think that trajectory should make people take seriously the extent to which religion took sex seriously. And like, if there's an author of the universe, if you can get to the point of believing that the author of the universe cares about you, which, as we said earlier, maybe you can't, but if you can, then he, they, whatever, probably cares about who you have sex with for the same reasons that you care about it. So that's sex. Institutional religion has done tons of terrible things, but I don't think there's any great evidence that religious societies are morally worse than secular societies, that worse things have been done in the name of religion than in the name of anything else. I think the evidence tends to run the other way. If we had an hour instead of 2 minutes, I would happily make a strong case that the monotheistic tradition in general is associated with a lot of things that we all consider moral improvement over the last few thousand years. Not that in every case, my own Catholic Church or the Jewish rabbinate or anything else is making all the right choices. Clearly they're not. But if you're looking arc of history, religions played a pretty important role in moral improvement. And societies that have cast off religion have not immediately become radically morally improved. I think the best case in that frame against religion is religion should be better, right? It shouldn't just be okay. It should be better, right? And the truth is that, again, like Old and New Testament alike, they are accounts of would-be chosen peoples who are always screwing up, right? The advertisement of both, the Jewish people and Jesus's disciples is, here's a story. It's a really important story. It's about how God chose us and how we just kept messing it up. Right. So at the very least, you can't say there's false advertising in Judaism and Christianity.
Shocking, actually. It's
and then the problem
for a marketing document, the Christian and Jewish Bibles are both surprisingly rich.
I mean, this is a separate thing, but I do think one of the small arguments for taking the truth claims of Abrahamic religion seriously is that neither the Old nor the New Testament reads like you would expect religious propaganda to read at all, which is interesting. Finally, the problem of evil, I think, is a real and serious problem that has no sort of podcast-ready solution. I think it's a big mistake to treat it as a reason not to be religious. I think if you accept, again, if you don't believe in God, fine, but if you accept sort of what I think is the good evidence for some kind of religious framework for the world, and then you're confronted with the problem of evil, you should say, well, either I need a theology that makes sense of this, and there are theologies that aren't, classical theism, that aren't, that are, sort of pantheism, dualism, the process theology. Like there's a bunch of different theologies that says, well, maybe God isn't omnipotent and omniscient in the way that Aquinas and Maimonides would have said, and that explains the problem of evil. I don't think those are the right call, but I think that's more sensible than becoming an atheist. But I also think within monotheism, you just have this sense that like this is actually something that if God exists, he wants us to wrestle with. And that's why, again, it's not a propaganda document, right? It's why Abraham is there arguing with God outside Sodom. It's why the entire book of Job exists. It's why the Garden of Gethsemane exists, right? That there is some kind of mystery here that is sometimes a reason to be angry at God and sometimes an understandable reason to lose, for a time, a sense of faith. But it's a argument that you're better off having inside the framework of belief than it is an argument for leaving that framework behind.
I did that. I did an episode with Susan Cain on her book Bittersweet, and for me, the Odyssey, especially the Jewish perspective on it, which there are a zillion pages of Jewish grappling with this fact that there's suffering in the world, and how can that be? But for me, it's a bittersweet thing. There's a lot of bitterness. The cruelty of human beings to each other is unfathomable and heartbreaking, and maybe damages your faith in God or your ability to search for God. But the ability of human beings to rise above their own sense of self and help other people, make sacrifices, love, strive, do extraordinary things, make ourselves laugh. The human carnival is just so rich. And, you could debate for whether the glass is half full or half empty. There's an extraordinary story by the Yiddish writer I.L. Peretz called The Three Gifts, which maybe we'll be able to find a link to it. I'm not sure it's online. It's a masterpiece on this question of whether the world is slightly better than it is worse or slightly worse than it is better. And it's our job to push it into the good realm. But that's the way I like to think about it. I don't know why there's evil in the world. As one rabbi once told me, I long ago stopped trying to figure out what's in God's briefcase. So when people say, how did the Holocaust happen in a world with God? There's a lot of answers. None of them are satisfying, really. There's nothing that brings comfort in that area. But what does bring comfort is the incredible kindnesses that people did for each other in death camps, that non-Jews struggled but managed sometimes, even once, but more than once, to save Jews. And finally, that, okay, maybe it's true. Maybe the world is an awful place, and I don't know why, but my job here is to try to make it a little bit better. I think that's a lovely way to look at the purpose and nature of human existence, and it's consistent with there being a God, even if I don't fully understand how that God runs the world. Clearly beyond that.
Yeah, I think if there's a problem of evil, and there's also a problem of good, right? From the perspective of the pure skeptic. The skeptic has to explain two things: both why there is this sort of surplus of, sort of moral aspiration in human beings that coexists with all the dark stuff. And they also have to explain just why everyday life has so many things in it that are extra good, right? Again, like you could imagine a world where we ate food and we did it from compulsion, but we didn't enjoy it the way we do. Same with sex, same with any aspect of human life. Like there's a lot of excessive good added in that gives me confidence that, at bottom, there is a goodness that is worth associating ourselves with, even if we don't understand why, if it's so powerful, it allows evil to persist as well.
I want to just mention a metaphor you use. You talk about an open door. I think it's a really beautiful metaphor when you think about the world of religion or the world of the transcendent. you can pass by an open door and not notice it. You can pass by and glance over toward it as you walk by. You can stop at the door and peer in, or you can enter the room and see what it looks and feels like to be there. And I think your book is an invitation to enter the room.
Hopefully. Hopefully at least somewhat appealing one. Yes.
What kind of reaction have you gotten from friends and colleagues? In a way, this is a brave book to write. You've sided with the irrational, unwashed. Shame on you. What?
I mean, people, my friends and colleagues already knew that I had a lot of weird ideas, honestly, Russ. So it's not, I think the most interesting thing about doing promotion for the book and having conversations like this one is just seeing the diversity of human relationships to religion. I think, I haven't had a lot of conversations with hard militant atheists. Hopefully I will, I should, right? But I've had a lot of conversations with people sort of in the borderlands between belief and disbelief. And everyone has sort of a different reaction. That's part of what's interesting. There are people for whom, the arguments for design and fine-tuning seem really powerful, but they can never imagine themselves believing in the supernatural. And then there are people for whom it's the reverse. I did a conversation with Andrew Sullivan, my fellow Catholic, he was just like, look, I don't believe in the fine-tuning stuff. The universe just seems too big. Earth is too small. It doesn't seem like we're here for a reason. It's only when you get to the personal and mystical that faith becomes compelling to him. And then there are just a lot of people for whom calling something God is too much, right? People for whom it's like, I agree with you. Materialism is a flawed paradigm. I agree with you. There's more to all this than meets the eye. But saying it's a God, it feels like presumptuous, or it has too much cultural baggage and so on. So I don't know. It's just been, I knew this, obviously. People have different reactions. But since I'm doing this argument where it's like converging lines, right? It's just really interesting to see which lines different people want to follow and which ones they're like, no, that can't be right. Right. Anyway, it's been very fun.
I want to close with a hardcore atheist who you mentioned in the book, which is Christopher Hitchens. You tell the story of encountering him in the kitchen of a party, and he asks you a question. I think it's a profound question. Give us the answer that speaks to you these days. Tell us what happened there.
So he said, I had debated him once. I was actually filling in for Andrew Sullivan. I was very young, and he was in his prime, and the debate didn't go well for God. So he, but he liked talking to believers, as everyone knew, and so he cornered me at a Christmas party and started in on this whole thing about how, what if, let's say we could prove it, right, that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead, right? What would that actually prove? And it was late at the party and I wasn't expecting that. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but it probably wasn't the thing I needed to say to, save Christopher Hitchens' soul. But I think that was a profound question generally, because I think there are a lot of people for whom, the possibility of weird things happening or mystical things happening and so on coexists with a sense of like, we can't, what can we do? What can we do about it? Right. You got to live your life.
And so part of,
not even who cares. No, I think Hitchens would say, I care. This is very interesting, but like, am I really going to organize my life around it? And so part of the point of this book is to say, like, there's enough stuff out there that it should, you don't have to embrace the particular, in that case, the particular doctrine of, Jesus as Messiah and divine person to say that should make you interested in religion, right? Like that should make you take religion seriously. And, religion, there's a lot of different ways to be religious, right? Like I have known monks, and I have known Christmas and Easter Catholics, and the monks are hopefully closer to God, but it's still better to be a Christmas and Easter Catholic than to have no connection to this possible reality at all. You should be trying to connect yourself to the possible reality, because it's very important. That's one thing. And then because I am a Christian, like, I do think that it's not just the story of the resurrection of Jesus is not just a story about a weird thing that randomly happened, like Michael Shermer's radio that we were talking about before. It's a thing that happened that was connected to the life that Jesus lived, the teaching that he offered, the way in which he died. He didn't just die of cancer and then get resurrected. He died in a particular public way, tortured by political and religious authorities, all the rest of it, right? That the Christian argument is that this is a drama that is connected to the drama of the Jewish people and is connected to a larger story of God's intervention in history in a way that, if you buy into it, helps make a larger sense out of what humans are and what they're doing. So it's not, the miracle alone is not the only signifier here. It is the story in which the miracle happens. And I think a lot of what the religious quest is human life is a story. We're living out we have our own story that's embedded in a larger story of the human race. And it's good to try and find the place where you think your story fits into the larger story. It doesn't mean you're absolutely right, but that is a very worthwhile endeavor, I think.
My guest today has been Ross Douthat. Ross, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.